Okay, firstly, I'd like to start this piece with asking why you've decided to talk about this and why you feel so passionately about the transgender movement in women's sport.
Yeah, it's not really an anti-trans position. It's never been an anti-trans position because I absolutely believe that everyone should be able to do sport. You know, I'm passionate about sport and I think it's really important for us. But it's always a pro-female position. And when the rules were changed in 2015, it was obvious what was going to happen. And so myself and a couple of other well-known female athletes just spent one Sunday afternoon getting 60 signatures from world and Olympic medalists, all of which are household names. And we wrote to the IOC and we said, please do not change the rules until you've done the science. You know, do the science first, because the science at the moment does not back up that you can eliminate male puberty, and there is a male puberty advantage. This is why we have men and women's sport. Otherwise we wouldn't. We would just have one classification of sport. And just like we don't have under 15-year-olds competing in the under 10s because it's unfair, we haven't historically allowed men to compete against women because it's unfair, because we're physiologically different. And there was no science, peer-reviewed studies to show that that had been eliminated. So I could see that women were going to end up losing their places on teams, their scholarships, their profiles, so therefore their future careers. It would impact them, financially and emotionally. So I just felt, having gone through what I went through in the 70s and the 80s with the East Germans, and nobody standing up for us and nobody doing anything about it, that I just couldn't sit back. And I knew that the athletes themselves were in a very difficult position, because the governing bodies were asking them not to speak out, were making them sign, contracts where they weren't allowed to show that they had concerns. And I just thought, well, I'm in a position where, as much as I knew it was going to affect me financially and it was going to affect me emotionally, as in I was going to be target, I just couldn't, my conscience wouldn't allow me to sit back and do and say nothing.
Right. And just to be clear, what are your thoughts then on transgender athletes competing in women's sport?
Well, transgender athletes competing at all. So this isn't just about, transgender athletes competing in women's events. However, what happens is that male-bodied people competing with women will impact the results, whereas females who identify as males competing with the men will not change the results in the slightest. So it doesn't impact on men's sport in any shape or form. And in fact, what happens has been proved at the Olympic Games and the NC2As is that people that are transgender males, i.e. biologically female, they still choose to compete with the women. And yet transgender women, biological males, choose to compete with the women, where they will get the biggest advantage. And that is what's happened, and that's what's unfair. So this was about opening debate, working with science and finding solutions for everybody, whether that was creating an open classification, whether that was adding classifications. But what was needed was debate. And what was happening was that debate was being closed down and we weren't allowed to talk about it. We just had to accept it.
So what do you say to people that would say, as a point to argue that transgender athletes can compete and should compete in women's sport? Laurel Hubbard competed in the Olympics in the female weightlifting classification and didn't win a gold medal. So how does that sit with your argument?
How is that relevant, though, whether she did or didn't win a gold medal? So she still had a place that belonged to a female athlete. So there was no female weightlifter from New Zealand entered in that competition because Laurel Hubbard had that position. So when Leah Thomas won the NC2As, Leah Thomas didn't just mean that there was one person affected. Leah Thomas was picked in instead of the female athlete for her university. Leah Thomas put out the person that would have been in the semi-finals. She then put out another person that would have been in the finals. She then put out the person who would have won, who was the female, who was then second. She then put out someone that would have been on the rostrum, who was fourth instead of third. So there was a minimum of 5 people that were affected in that one competition, in that one race. So this is the knock-on effect that it has, and also how that knock-on affects to young females looking to go into sport when they think, well, no matter how good I am, how do I win if I have a disadvantage before I even start? So it's, if transgender males can still identify as being male even though they are biologically female perfectly happily in the female classification, why can it not work the other way as well? Why is it that males are not being more inviting to transgender women in their classification of sport, and yet women can be inviting of transgender men in their classification of sport? So sport is all about biology. It's all about how our bodies work. And at Olympic sport, there's a difference between 10 and 30%. So weightlifting, 30%, absolutely massive. When I know that 9% can make such a huge difference because of my experience with the East Germans, I know giving away just the 2 or 3% at Olympic level is just ridiculous. You know, when Olympic medals are won by hundredths of a second.
What does the scientific research suggest, and how does that affect your argument?
So there isn't a single peer-reviewed study in the world that shows that you can remove male puberty biology advantage. Not a single one. There are studies that show you can reduce it down to maybe 5% from 10%. Weightlifting, you're probably going to be able to not reduce that down from 30% maybe to 23%, but it's still not levelling the playing field in any shape or form. So Joanna Harper, who is a transgender scientist who at the moment is doing some studies at Loughborough, believes that meaningful competition is the word that she uses. What does that mean? Does that mean that women are just supposed to accept that we race with a 5% disadvantage? When men are never accepted to do that. You know, we had shoes that Nike brought out with a carbon layer, which meant that some of the athletes that were sponsored by Nike would have an advantage. That was not allowed to happen. Men said, this will not happen. You will not race with those shoes because that will give you an advantage over me. Even though it was the tiniest advantage, it was not happen. When Oscar Pistorius wanted to race in the Olympic Games with his blades, men went, you might beat us. This is not happening. But in women's sport, it's perfectly okay for us to accept that we're supposed to have meaningful competition with a 5% disadvantage.
So is there research then that suggests that a transgender female would have an advantage?
Absolutely. As I've just said, there's no peer-reviewed study in the world that shows that you can remove the puberty advantage that comes from biological male puberty. So none. So yes, absolutely. And everything that we've seen, whether that's Leah Thomas going from being, 462nd in the men's events to being number one in the women's events, or Laurel Hubbard, who was 43 and 20 years retired from competitive weightlifting at his prime when he was competing as a 23-year-old, there isn't a single piece of evidence that shows that it's fair.
What would you say to any transgender athlete that just wants to compete in sport?
And they should be able to. Absolutely, they should be able to, but they have to compete where their biology fits the category. We have categories in sport for a reason, to try to create fair sports. And, that sport by nature is exclusionary. That's what categories are there for, is to exclude people who have an advantage and to create fairness. So, I'm sorry, but it's not fair to all the other women in the race, the biological females, who are expected to give up fair sports, when males are not expected to give up fair sports.
And are we saying then that it would be different if a transgender male athlete was to compete in male
If they wish
sports?
to, I don't think anyone has a problem with that, but what you're finding is they don't do that. The only class where it might be difficult is if you've got a transgender man, a biological female, who's on testosterone, and then they would be allowed to compete in the women's classification. So here's another piece of really interesting statistic for you, which is an absolute fact. So at the moment, it's either 10 nanomole if it's NC2As, or it's 5 nanomole if it was British cycling, for example, with Emily Bridges. So 5 nanomoles of testosterone per litre of blood is the level that they expect you to bring males to bring their testosterone levels down to. A woman on the whole, on average, is below 1. All right. If I was to race tomorrow morning with 5 nanomoles of testosterone in my system, I would instantly receive a 4-year ban. And yet Emily Bridges is allowed to compete with 5 nanomoles of testosterone in her system. Again, how is that possibly fair?
You've spoken on social media a little bit about your thoughts on this, and it's great that we're giving you now a platform to expand on that and give some more context around those thoughts. But what has been some of the responses that you've had to some of your social media comments or comments elsewhere on this topic?
So the trans activists are very vocal, can be very violent, can be do their absolute best to try to get you cancelled, to try to get you to lose work. When Kelly Holmes spoke out about it, they rang all her sponsors, they tried to get her removed from her job. I'm sure I've had exactly the same thing. Luckily, most of the people that I work for have stood by me. And I think we are beginning to turn the corner now in the fact that what happened for a long time was that no debate was allowed. And now we are beginning to be allowed to have a voice and be allowed to have a debate. And I'm quite confident that next month we will see some of the governing bodies change their rules. The IOC have passed the buck, as they always do. And now the buck stops with the governing bodies. And the governing bodies, I think, have now become under quite a lot of pressure from the science community, from their athletes themselves, from the female athletes who are now beginning to sign petitions, be asked questions. We saw in British cycling, that the girls had decided that they were going to boycott that race to show that it's just not fair. So I think, people are beginning to listen now, and I think that's a really good thing. It's important that we can talk about it without calling everybody names. Just because you want fair sport does not make you transphobic. Fair sport for women is just asking for fair sport for women, particularly when we've made so many, big strides over the last few years. To potentially lose it all, it's not right. I think we will find, and it's also not the way the public feels. So if you ask the public, if there's an article in, the Mail or the Times or, any of the newspapers, and then you look at the comments, 99.9% want fair sport. So, we need to talk about this all together. We need to be respectful of each other, and we need to find solutions, because as I've always said, sport is for everybody, and we need to find everyone's place.
Do you think that your injustices as an athlete previously have kind of driven your views on this completely and nothing else?
There's no doubt about it. The fact that I felt that there was an injustice against my generation, it wasn't just me. There were British athletes that came forth that no one has ever heard of, who would have been Olympic champions had it not been for the East Germans. There's a wonderful athlete called Kathy Cook, who held the British record for the 400 metres, and it was only beaten fairly recently by Christina Horogu, and it took her winning the World Championships to break that British record. Kathy works as a school teacher, and hardly anyone knows who she is, because of the East Germans. I feel like there was a massive injustice that was done and is still not being corrected. And I could not sleep at night and let the whole thing happen again to another generation of young female athletes.
So last question really, how do we fix it? In your opinion, where do we go from here?
I think we have to decide that sport is about biology. It's very affected by the physical aspect of who we actually are. So whether you feel like someone who is of the opposite sex, your actual biological sex is either male or female. And it is immutable, and no amount of cross-sex hormones will change that. And the DNA and chromosomes that you have in your body when you are born will be the ones that you have in your body when you die. I think there's a tremendous amount of social contagion that's going on. And I think we're regressing with regards to what saying someone is by being female or male. As far as I'm concerned, you can be anything you want to be as a female. You can be anything you want to be as a male. And if that means that you want to do things that people see historically as being more feminine, then that's about society being more accepting. That's not about society saying you have to change your gender to be accepted.
That's it from me. Thank you so much for your time, Sharron. Is there anything else that you would like to say to get your point across, or are you happy with?
No, not at all. I think you kind of got the grasp of it all.
Great.
I honestly, because I've been involved in sport all my life, I'm a big believer that we're all equal. I was brought up with people from all over the world, with all colours and all religions and all sexualities, and I don't see it. I just see people. I was married to, a black man. I have mixed race children. I don't see colour. I don't see religion. I don't care what your sexuality is. I just judge people on whether they're good or bad people.
Thank you so much for your time, Sharron.
You're welcome.